Andrew Jackson found a true partner in Rachel Donaldson. Historian Peter Cozzens recounts the words of Thomas Hart Benton, a man who would later shoot Jackson in self-defense, about the new Miss Jackson. A more exemplary woman in all the relations of life, wife, friend, neighbor, mistress of slaves never lived, and never presented a more quiet, cheerful, and admirable management of her household. She had no education, he said, but she had a heart and a good one, and that was always leading her to do kind things in the kindest manner. But Rachel brought more than character. She brought connections, networks that would propel Andrew Jackson onto the nation's political stage. In 1796, after serving as Attorney General for Middle Tennessee, Jackson became Tennessee's first member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Just a year later, he was appointed to the Senate. His rise seemed meteoric. The sky, it appeared, was the limit. Yet his legendary temper often got the better of him. Even Thomas Jefferson took notice. Serving as president of the Senate while vice president beneath John Adams, Jefferson recorded in his private journals the words, "But Andrew Jackson's passions are terrible. He would never speak on account of the rashness of his feelings. I have seen him attempt it repeatedly, and as often choke with rage. His passions are no doubt cooler now. He has been much tried since I knew him, but he is a dangerous man." The term dangerous man carries weight. It echoes the language that once precipitated the fatal duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. For Jefferson, it was likely more than metaphor. Andrew Jackson would soon become America's most famous duelist. So famous, in fact, that Wikipedia hosts an entire page titled List of Violent Incidents Involving Andrew Jackson. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon America's 7th president, Andrew Jackson. Episode number 2, Blood on the Frontier. By the early 1800s, dueling was starting to fade from American life, especially after the death of Alexander Hamilton in 1804. Yet Andrew Jackson had already carved out a reputation as a duelist of fearsome renown. But it wasn't skill that made him feared, it was tenacity, and nowhere was that more evident than in his duel with Charles Dickinson, a man who had escalated an argument over a horse racing debt by insulting Jackson's beloved wife. Robert Brammer, writing for the Library of Congress, recounts the deadly encounter for us. The combatants met at Harrison's Mill, Kentucky, to settle their differences with a duel. Jackson knew that Dickinson had a reputation as a formidable marksman, so he resolved to hold his fire, allowing Dickinson to fire first and then carefully aim before returning fire. Jackson also took the precaution of wearing a coat that was too large for his frame, hoping this would cause Dickinson's shot to miss his heart. Dickinson fired first, and it appeared that he missed his mark. Jackson then took careful aim and pulled the trigger. But his pistol locked at half-cock. Though it had first appeared Dickinson's shot had spared Jackson, in fact it had struck his breastbone and injured his ribs, causing blood to trickle down Jackson's leg and accumulate in his shoe. Struggling through the pain, Jackson steadied himself, recocked his pistol, and fired, striking Dickinson in the stomach, killing him before the day was done. Dickinson's shot had missed Jackson's heart by mere centimeters. The bullet lodged so dangerously close that doctors refused to remove it. For the rest of his life, Jackson carried the damage, experiencing intense chest pain. But he felt no bitterness. When asked about the duel, he simply said, "If he had shot me through the brain, sir, I still would have killed him." This wasn't even an isolated incident. 3 years earlier, Jackson had been involved in a shootout with the governor after the man claimed that the only service Jackson had provided Tennessee was to take a trip to Nantes with another man's wife. These and countless other episodes cemented Andrew Jackson's reputation as a violent, vengeful man. Nashville's high society recoiled from him, wary of his temper, his pride, and the lethal consequences of crossing him. And just in case you were wondering, yes, the site of Jackson's famous duel at Harrison's Hill is marked today by a plaque sponsored by Cracker Barrel, ensuring that the legacy of frontier bloodshed comes with a side of biscuits. If slavery was, in the words of historians, as American as capitalism, nationalism, or democracy, then so too was the deep-rooted fear and hatred of native peoples on the frontier. The two weren't separate stories, they ran in parallel. Slavery built wealth through land cultivation. Indian removal made that land and that wealth available to frontier settlers. One enforced by chains, the other by rifles. And Andrew Jackson would play a central role in both. The threat from native nations was real. In 1791, Jackson stumbled upon a potentially hostile party. Scrambling for safety, he rode through the night, fording a river on a hastily constructed raft. Swept downstream towards a steep waterfall, he narrowly avoided disaster and waved off his companion, saying, "A miss is as good as a mile. It only shows how close I can graze danger. But we have no time to lose. Follow me, and I'll save you yet." This wasn't just empty bravado. Jackson, at his best, could channel his rage, and the frontier funneled that rage into violent action. Meacham notes, Jackson's willingness to risk his own life to protect others won him the respect and thanks of his contemporaries, and made them amenable to forgiving him his many trespasses. It was he who escorted parties of settlers through forests filled with Indians. It was he who enforced justice in a region that could have turned lawless. From 1798 to 1804, Jackson served as a judge on the Tennessee Superior Court. In more than one case, he overstepped the law, becoming not just judge, but executioner. When a local sheriff confessed he was too afraid to confront an accused baby murderer, Jackson armed himself and threatened to blow the culprit through. For Jackson, morality rarely waited for procedure. As a judge, he enforced the law as he saw fit. As president, he would later claim the right to ignore a Supreme Court ruling. His toughness and decisiveness made him a living legend in Tennessee, culminating in his appointment as general of the state militia in 1802. A decade later, the War of 1812 would cement his national reputation. Eager to fight the British again, Jackson first confronted the Muskogee in what became known as the Creek War, the first major military foray of his career. His victories there set the stage for his most famous campaign, pushing the British out of New Orleans in the closing days of the War of 1812. This was the war that would launch Jackson's career and later provide the cover for the Trail of Tears. To understand it, we have to understand the people he fought, the Muskogee. They were descendants of the great civilizations of the Mississippi Valley, whose temples and cities had been destroyed centuries earlier by Hernando de Soto. Smallpox and European conquest left the land scarred, the ancient cities reclaimed by dense southern forests. The name Muskogee comes from the Algonquin word muskeg, meaning swamp or flood-prone land. By the early 1700s, European settlers called them the Creek Indians, after the rivers and streams that ran through their homeland. From the ruins of the Mississippi chiefdoms arose 4 major southeastern nations: the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Cherokees, and the Creeks. As Cozens explains, the Creeks believed life was an eternal struggle between peace and war, a dualism reflected in the division of talwas, or villages. Whites signified peace and purity, red, war. Creeks painted their buildings, ceremonial items, and even their bodies to signal their village affiliation. Creek society was decentralized and matriarchal, meaning that decisions often sought consensus. When the Creek War erupted, the Red Talwas tried to persuade their white brethren to join them against settlers. Gender roles were clearly defined. Women managed children and food, men tilled the fields and hunted. But it was war that was central to Creek culture. Young men proved themselves to prospective mates by displaying scalps from enemies. Cozen notes, because opportunities to take scalps or prisoners were at a premium, aspiring Creek warriors sometimes covertly murdered their own people on the margins of raids to obtain hair. The scalps of enemy women and children were always fair game. While Creek warriors never raped women, which they feared would diminish their war powers, killing non-combatants was acceptable practice in all southeastern tribes. The problem for the Creeks was land. Their 84,000 square mile homeland was prime for plantation agriculture. In 1791, American Indian agent Caleb Swan warned, "The climate of this inland country is remarkably healthy. It must become a most delectable part of the United States, and one day or other will be the seat of manufacturers and commerce." The Creeks had long adapted to European encroachment, leveraging alliances with the English, French, and Spanish, and even controlling parts of the Native American slave trade in order to obtain guns and goods. Between 1670 and 1715, Cozen writes, they funneled at least 20,000 captives to Carolina, becoming the best armed and most feared indigenous group in the South. When Africans became the preferred labor source, the Creeks shifted to hunting runaways, often caught in Georgia, where the English had designed the colony to intercept escapees. Trade and European demand altered daily life. Leather for European markets led the Creeks to overhunt their lands. Traders lived within the talwas, sometimes taking local wives. But after the French and Indian War, power shifted decisively to the British. Their 1763 proclamation forbade settlers from crossing the Appalachians, an attempt to limit conflict, which failed spectacularly. Settlers poured in anyway, often the worst the colonies had to offer. In Alexis de Tocqueville's words, rootless people, often outcasts in their home states, filled with greedy desires, without family connections or tradition or morality. The proclamation also disrupted trade and land agreements. The Crown negotiated 5 land cessations with the Creeks over the next decade, shrinking their territory to the Oskoji River. New traders flooded in, prioritizing profit over the well-being of the Creeks. Cozen writes, the new breed of peddlers found it more profitable to deal in alcohol that bewitched Creek men than in the trade goods the Creeks truly needed. In a country awash in alcohol, life became cheap and tempers grew short. While Creek men bartered deerskins for drink, Creek women prostituted themselves for essential trade goods. The stage was set. A proud, adaptive people were being squeezed from all sides, by settlers, by merchants, by disease, and by the appetite of an expanding United States. And Andrew Jackson, newly hardened on the frontier, was about to arrive. The Creeks had tried to remain neutral during the Revolutionary War, but neutrality could not shield them from the tidal wave of population growth and settler expansion. By the 1790s, the Creek Confederacy had raised an army of 5,000 warriors, a statement as clear as it was defiant. Previous treaties made under duress held no weight. Violence erupted, brutal and personal. Historian Peter Kozin writes that Georgians committed atrocities that read more like nightmares than history. Slaying Creek women alive, cutting infants out of their mothers' wombs, and stuffing the mouths of dead men with their severed penises. The Creeks retaliated in kind, taking dismembered body parts as trophies, holding captives for ransom, sometimes white women and children. And the grimmest markets, a prepubescent girl could fetch $10. The newly minted United States watched, wary. President George Washington recognized the danger, fearing that unchecked violence could draw Spain into a regional war that America wasn't prepared for. To stabilize the frontier, Washington sought treaties with native nations, including the Creeks. At the 1790 treaty ceremony in New York City, Alexander McGillivray, the leading voice of the Creek delegation, spoke with quiet dignity. "We want nothing from you but justice. We want our hunting grounds preserved from encroachments. They have been ours from the beginning of time." Henry Knox, Washington's Secretary of War, affirmed the principle. The Indians, being the prior occupants, possess the right of the soil. It cannot be taken from them unless by their free consent. The Treaty of New York was historic. It established a framework for relations between the United States and a sovereign native nation, and restored land that had been wrongfully ceded to Georgia. But peace proved fleeting. Within 2 years, the Creeks were again at war with the state of Georgia. Kozin observes, Creek raiders generally refrained from crossing the Treaty of New York boundaries. Georgians, on the other hand, ranged well beyond the border. More often than not, they were the aggressors in the desultory warfare that smoldered from 1793 to 1795. Violence escalated to the point that the Secretary of War ordered 200 troops to Georgia's frontier, not to fight the Creeks, but to keep the peace. And when push came to shove, that meant shooting American citizens. Sustained periods of fear have a way of opening doors for governments to seize powers they could never claim in calmer times. In 1796, the Creek Confederacy agreed to amend the Treaty of New York to allow U.S. military bases on their land. The promise was protection from further settler incursions. But as any frontier dweller knew, there's always a price, and if something seems too good to be true, it usually is. The new military bases came with a heavy-handed presence. Benjamin Hawkins, appointed as the principal Indian agent, arrived to implement Washington's vision. Hawkins' mission was clear: assimilate the Creek. Private property, cattle farming, centralized governance, anything that could erode traditional hunting practices. Success for Hawkins would mean more land for the U.S., a windfall for settlers eager to escape depleted coastal soils. Then in 1800, Thomas Jefferson ascended to the presidency. The first Republican president, a champion of states' rights, set his sights on expansion. Kozin notes, if President Jefferson had his way, all American Indians east of the Mississippi River would have markedly less of one commodity: land. Jefferson assumed office in 1801, keen to acquire every inch of Indian country between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River he could, without provoking war. Rather than negotiating directly with the Creek, Jefferson cut a deal with Georgia. For $1.25 million, the state handed over 86 million acres, securing a federal promise to dismantle the legal protections that had upheld native land claims. Meanwhile, after acquiring New Orleans and the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson needed roads through Creek country to connect the port to the capital. The Creeks agreed to a system of ferry crossings, toll bridges, and taverns, believing it was a fair exchange. In reality, the road system funneled profit into the hands of a few chiefs, widening an already dangerous gap between the wealthy and poor, the red and the white. Then came 1804, a drought that lasted 8 years. While wealthy plantation-owning Creeks survived the ordeal, those who relied upon hunting or small-scale agriculture starved. Poor Creeks witnessed a growing divide between themselves and wealthy slave-owning Creeks, who refused to help, a stark rejection of Muskogee values. By the time the rains returned in 1812, resentment had smoldered into a tinderbox, waiting for a spark. And that spark came in the form of the Great Comet of 1811. Arriving just before the comet was Tecumseh. The celebrated Shawnee warrior sought to unite Native nations against further American encroachment. While most Creeks rejected his call, a faction of Red Creeks answered, swept up in his vision. The Madison administration, preoccupied with looming war with England, ignored Creek protests over the widening of federal roads needed to transport heavy artillery to New Orleans. Tecumseh's converts, seeing disaster and divine displeasure in the drought and the loss of game, became the first prophets of what would be called the Red Stick War. They preached that the gods demanded a return to old ways, a rejection of the white man's goods, except for guns, of course. Only then would the deer return to their lands. Only then would balance be restored. Then nature itself seemed to weigh in. A massive 5-minute earthquake destroyed the village of New Madrid. For the next 2 months, thousands of aftershocks rattled the land. Creek storytellers whispered, "Tecumseh has stamped his foot for war." If push comes to shove, I generally fall on the side of Native Americans. That aligns me with a wave of historians who increasingly call early American policy by its harshest name: genocide. Historian Ned Blackhawk puts it bluntly, using the definitions established by the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Historians have located genocide across Native American history. He goes on to say that identifying American history as a site of genocide complicates a fundamental premise of the American story. Indeed, histories of Native America provide the starkest contrast to the American ideal. Native American studies scholars often view the conquest of the Americas as an ongoing process marked by mass violence that connects diverse Native nations. As a believer in the American ideal, I regret huge swaths of my nation's history. Our treatment of Native peoples remains shameful. Reservations are desperately poor, some to such a degree that they have been persuaded to accept the burial of hazardous nuclear waste on their lands. Native life expectancy runs roughly a decade below the national average. Schools are chronically underfunded, food insecurity is higher, and suicide rates for Native teens and young adults are 3 times the U.S. average. At the same time, wars are rarely neat. U.S. policy and the rapacious hunger of frontier settlers push many Creeks into Tecumseh's orbit. That's understandable. When people have their backs against a wall, they often pick up arms. What's much harder to forgive is the brutal violence unleashed by some Red Stick warriors. For instance, one return party from Tippecanoe came upon the Manly homestead. The scene was horrific. Cozen describes it for us. War whoops rent the gentle May morning. Outside, warriors bludgeoned to death and scalped 2 of the Crawley children. They bashed Mrs. Manly's infant against a wall, slew her older children, and then scalped and shot Ms. Manly twice at close range, the powder burning out one of her eyes. Leaving her for dead, they hauled a terrified Martha Crawley across the Tennessee River, but not before she hid her other 2 children in a cellar. 2 or 3 days after the raid, John Crawley and Jessie Manley returned to the plundered corpse-strewn cabin. Breathing fitfully, Mrs. Manley lay on her blood-soaked bed. She lingered several days more before dying. I'm not naive. Settlers committed atrocities too. But the Creek War is littered with horrific murder, scalped victims, dismembered mothers, unborn children torn from wombs. News like that hardened hearts. When Andrew Jackson, Major General of the West Tennessee Militia, heard about the Manley and Crawley killings, he wrote, "My heart bleeds on the receipt of the news of the horrid cruelty and murders committed by a party of Creeks on our innocent wives and little babes. They must be punished, and our frontier protected. And as I have no doubt but they are urged on by British agents and tools, the sooner they can be attacked, the less will be their resistance, and the fewer will be the nations or tribes that we will have to war with. It is therefore necessary for the protection of the frontier that we march into the Creek Nation, demand the perpetrators at the point of the bayonet, and if refused, then we make reprisals and lay their towns in ashes." Note how Jackson frames it. Find the perpetrators. Punish them. Protect the frontier. He does not call for the slaughter of every Indian in the area. In fact, Cherokee warriors fought alongside Jackson during the campaign and won his praise. That praise tragically did not extend to Jackson's presidency and the later forced removals. The Creeks tried to police the violence themselves, but the Red Sticks were a decentralized insurgency. Their recruits often tried to outdo one another in brutality. As violence spread, calls for settler reprisal mounted. A Georgia Journal piece put it plainly: the Creeks are divided into 2 parties. Civil war will break out among them and save us the trouble of chastising their insolence and violence. Our frontier is thickly settled with a brave and hardy population, who wait only for the word to strike a blow, which if it does not exterminate, will drive them forever from the territory they now occupy. Washington and Congress were distracted by the War of 1812. Federal forces had floundered in Canada. A British threat loomed. The Creek crisis fell to the southern states, and those states were not looking to negotiate. Jackson commanded about 2,500 volunteer militia from western Tennessee, called up for 1 year. He waited months for orders. Finally, he was told to reinforce Major General James Wilkinson at New Orleans. When the march took him through Creek country, Wilkinson countermanded the movement and ordered Jackson to remain where he was. 2 months later, in February 1813, orders arrived to disband. But Jackson refused. "If it was intended by this order that we should be dismissed 500 miles from home," Jackson wrote, "deprived of arms, tents, and supplies for the sick, of our arms and supplies for the well, it appears that these brave men, who certainly deserve a better fate and return from their government, was intended by this order to be sacrificed, to pass through the savage land where our women and children and defenseless citizens are daily murdered." Instead of disbanding, he kept the force together and marched them back to Tennessee. On that grueling trek, he earned a new nickname, Old Hickory, for his toughness. The government never court-martialed him for insubordination, but it did refuse to pay the troops for the return journey. Jackson covered their wages from his own pocket, an expense that nearly bankrupted him. The Nashville Whig later praised him. "Long will their general live in the memory of the volunteers of West Tennessee for his benevolent, humane, and fatherly treatment to his soldiers." This period also saw another of Jackson's violent episodes, the Bennett Affair. Thomas Hart Bennett's brother had served under Jackson. After an insult, Benton asked Jackson to act as his second in a duel. Jackson tried to defuse the matter. It failed. Benton was wounded in the buttocks, humiliated. His brother threatened to horsewhip Jackson for his involvement in the duel, but Jackson responded not by waiting, but riding into town with a horsewhip, intending to personally punish the man's insolence. The confrontation became a pitched brawl. 3 bullets hit Jackson, 1 shattered his left shoulder and lodged near the bone. A doctor began an amputation, but Jackson stared him down and stopped the blade, coolly responding, "I'll keep my arm." 5 days later, Fort Mims in Alabama fell to the Creeks. Eyewitnesses described the slaughter with shocking detail. The way that many of the unfortunate women were mangled and cut to pieces is shocking to humanity, for many of the women who were pregnant had their unborn infants cut from the womb and lay by their bleeding mothers. All the women were stripped of every article of clothing. Not satisfied with this, the Red Sticks scalped every solitary one, taking the skin of the whole head so as to make many scalps. Tennessee's militia was recalled and ordered to repel a Creek invasion. Wounded but undeterred, Jackson declared himself ready to lead the campaign. Cozens captures the mood and the stakes, writing, "Governor Blunt and Old Hickory were clear on the unprecedented opportunity that the present crisis presented. Victory over the Red Sticks would be but the prelude to dispossessing all Creeks of their lands, dislodging the Spanish from West Florida, and preventing the pernicious hand of Great Britain from grasping the Gulf Coast. Tennessee's defensive invasion of the Creek country was to be a war of conquest." Old Hickory was tough, but he was hardly fit for a long campaign. His left arm remained in a sling. He needed help to mount his horse. The expedition stalled again and again as their general battled wave after wave of explosive diarrhea. Still, with British Canada menacing in the rear, the Madison administration left the slog to the states. Militias from Tennessee, Mississippi, and Georgia moved into Creek country. Cherokee warriors joined the expedition, hoping to earn Washington's favor. Jackson insisted the Cherokee be paid the same as his white soldiers, a rare moment of parity amid the violence. Supply, not bullets, threatened to stop the campaign. One major Red Stick recruiting pitch was simple. There were no deer left in Creek hunting grounds. The resulting famine nearly derailed Jackson's plans. He admitted plainly, "There is no enemy whom I dread much more than I do the hostile Creeks. I mean the meager monster famine. Willingly I would endure the worst of all earthly evils than see my army starving in the enemy's country." Short on provisions, Jackson's men began plundering corn cribs, even those belonging to loyal Creeks. Jackson rounded up a number of Allied Creek prisoners and sent them to Nashville for the duration of the war. He dug in at Fort Strother, preparing for a protracted campaign, while reading reports of bloody skirmishes like Tallahatchie, where Private Davy Crockett later confessed to shooting his enemies like dogs. After one engagement, Jackson's interpreter found a small boy on the battlefield, Lincoln, whose family had been killed. Jackson later told his wife Rachel that the child's fate mirrored his own Revolutionary-era losses. Feeling in a charitable mood, he adopted the boy into his Hermitage household for Andrew Jr., writing Rachel, "Keep Lincoln in the house. He is savage by one that fortune has thrown into my hands. I therefore want him well taken care of. He may have been given to me for some valuable purpose. In fact, when I reflect that he is so much like myself, I feel an unusual sympathy for him." Adopting an orphan child does not erase Jackson's role in a campaign that historians estimate caused 8,000 to 10,000 deaths among the Creek and Allied peoples. But the gesture does reveal how Jackson imagined his mission. not just conquest, but protection of settlers, of soldiers, and oddly, of a child he compared to himself. Still, victory remained elusive. Jackson's second-in-command grumbled that never was a general sent out so poorly provided for by the government as General Jackson. Were he anything less than he is, the whole expedition would speedily come to nothing. But he seems to derive additional animation from the difficulties he has to encounter. He is determined to push the enemy to the gates of Pensacola and to destroy that place if it furnishes them assistance. Jackson would indeed push, and the consequences would reshape the region forever. Jackson secured a major tactical victory against a 1,000-man strong Red Stick force at the Battle of Talladega. Yet the campaign's chronic supply issues led to a deadly miscommunication. Another general, unaware of the back-channel negotiations that Jackson had opened, attacked the Hillaby villages. The Hillaby had expected Jackson. Instead, they faced General Cook and a Cherokee contingent that slaughtered 64 unresisting warriors. Jackson, ever focused on outcomes rather than protocol, simply congratulated Cook on the lopsided nature of the victory. Cozen notes that, in the wake of Jackson's victories, the Red Sticks abandoned any notion of conquest. Instead, they became more cautious and thought how they might evade total annihilation. The survivors eventually withdrew to 3 fortified strongholds. Time favored the Creeks. This was their country. They knew every river bend and hiding place. Cut off on all sides, their prophets saw no path to outright victory, only to endurance. The tide briefly turned against them when Mississippi militia stormed the so-called Holy Ground, a sacred refuge deep in the swamps reachable only by canoe. In freezing weather, short on food and supplies, the soldiers pushed through. 10 days' march, a brutal river crossing, and seized the place. The victory, though, came at a cost. Discipline unraveled. 9 days later, with morale collapsing and mutiny brewing, General Claiborne released his men rather than watch them tear themselves apart. The Georgians held on for 2 months longer, but winter broke them. Starving, barefoot, shivering, they threatened mutiny and were sent home. That left Andrew Jackson and Jackson alone to carry the campaign forward. Where others had cracked, he pushed on, holding a fragile line at the northern edge of Red Stick country. His leadership was tested again and again over a matter of weeks. He stumbled upon 150 head of cattle, but food alone could not stomach the raw nerves. A company, fed up with the slow progress, headed for home. Jackson galloped after them, roaring, "By the immaculate God, I'll blow the damned villains to eternity if they advance another step." Days later, 1,000 volunteers declared they'd had enough. Jackson rode to the front of the column, his left arm still in a sling, musket across his horse's neck, vowing to shoot the first man who tried to leave. When numbers made a single execution impractical, he promised a darker fate. He swore he would visit each deserter's home and personally put them to death. As December approached, the crisis boiled over. December 10th marked the end of the volunteers' official term of service. A regimental commander wrote Jackson pleading for mercy. These were poor farmers who needed to return to their fields or risk financial ruin. The men felt pride in serving under Jackson, the letter said, and regarded him as an affectionate father. Jackson's answer was theatrical and terrifying. On the eve of the planned desertion, he ordered a parade at 8 p.m., assembled the regiment, and pointed to cannons squared on them from the hills. Then he warned, loudly enough for all to hear, that if you do go home, you shall pass over the body of your general. It was a cruel, combustible mixture of duty, desperation, and intimidation. and for better or worse, it kept his army together long enough to keep fighting. No one had yet fled, but Jackson knew his men couldn't endure much longer in their ragged state. Salvation seemed to arrive on December 12th with 1,450 East Tennesseans, yet their presence quickly proved more burden than blessing. Their enlistments were set to expire in 2 weeks, and meanwhile they consumed more than they contributed to the army's scant supplies. Jackson, exhausted and increasingly desperate, even joked or half believed that the Creek prophets had cursed his men. But superstition wasn't the only enemy that he faced. A rumor spread almost immediately that Jackson intended to keep these recruits in service for another 6 months. The reaction was explosive. Hundreds swore they would rather kill Old Hickory than remain under his command. One group that never wavered was the so-called Black Corps, a contingent of enslaved attendants who accompanied Jackson's officers throughout the Creek War. Though never officially enlisted, they were indispensable, cooking, tending to the sick, maintaining equipment, and managing the logistics that kept the army functioning through hunger, disease, and freezing conditions. Their labor went unrecognized in military records. They received neither freedom nor reward, only the heavy burden of necessity and coercion. Even Tennessee seemed to turn against him. The governor washed his hands of the problem, claiming raising new volunteers was now a federal matter. But Jackson refused to retreat. His honor wouldn't allow it. In a fiery rebuke, he questioned the integrity of nearly everyone around him. Paranoia and bitterness took hold. He became convinced some officers sought to elevate themselves at his expense. Tensions grew so high that he once leveled a pistol at a lieutenant who had the audacity to inform him that his enlistment had officially ended. Relief finally arrived in the form of 800 mounted volunteers, but it came with its own frustration. A clerical error had enlisted them for only 60 days instead of the 6 months Jackson had requested. Still, he refused to sulk. Determined to act swiftly, he set his sights on one of the remaining Red Stick strongholds. Advisors warned of the risk, but Jackson, as always, never backed down from a fight. He found his target 30 miles to the southeast. That night, the rhythmic pulse of a Red Stick war dance drifted through the trees, a haunting signal that the enemy was preparing for battle. Jackson set his lines, planning to strike at first light. But Menoa, the Red Stick war chief, once a horse thief turned respected leader, decided to take the initiative. With the rising sun at their backs, the Red Sticks launched a surprise attack. What Menoa didn't know was that Jackson, ever the taskmaster, had instituted a 4 a.m. wake-up call for his troops. Instead of catching them off guard, the enemy charged into a fully alert and ready force. The assault was repelled, but Menoa regrouped. At noon, the Red Sticks attacked a second time. This assault caught the Tennesseans off guard. Ranks faltered. A major was killed. Jackson's closest aide was shot, and for a fleeting moment, the line threatened to collapse. Until Cherokee allies arrived just in time to swing momentum back towards Jackson. The soldiers braced for a night assault that never came. Still, tension ran so high that a single accident nearly triggered panic. A sleepwalking private collided headfirst with a tree, screaming, "Indians in the camp!" The entire force scrambled for weapons, convinced the Red Sticks had returned. Jackson's next letter to Rachel revealed a rare moment of humility. He realized he'd underestimated the fortified log walls. He ordered a retreat, but the Red Sticks were ready, ambushing the usual river crossing. Jackson, anticipating this, had prepared an alternative route. When the attack finally came, Jackson remained composed. "I felt rejoiced," he wrote. "The ground was of my own choosing, and I knew that if the men would stand and fight, I would destroy 9 out of every 10 of the enemy. The men, however, were green, on short-term enlistments and terrified by warriors in full war paint. They panicked, fleeing across the river in a chaotic stampede, far from the heroic last stand Jackson had imagined. Once again, it was the Cherokee allies who stabilized the situation, a detail absent from Jackson's official report. That report also downplayed how close his army had come to destruction. In that official report, Jackson claimed that there were 5 benefits of their new position. Historians consider 3 of those 5 benefits outright fabrications. Yet timing was on his side. 3 years into the War of 1812, the public was desperate for victories. Jackson's embellished story fit the need perfectly. The result? A promotion to brigadier general in the regular army. Andrew Jackson had failed, but in the peculiar alchemy of politics and perception, he had failed upward. Stubborn as a jackass, Andrew Jackson remained in Creek lands, patiently rebuilding his forces with the arrival of irregulars sent by Washington. But even that couldn't lift his mood. Old Hickory had threatened to kill several would-be deserters. His bluster mostly amounted to forcing soldiers to wear their shirts inside out with the word deserter painted across them, a punishment lasting only 2 weeks. When James Woods ignored an officer, however, he was court-martialed and executed by firing squad. Cozen notes, the execution stunned the army. No other militia general then serving in the United States would have sanctioned it except Jackson. But the impact proved salutary. That night, not a word was heard in camp, recollected a soldier. We were all as silent as death. General Jackson had no more plague with mutinies. Now at the head of a true army, Jackson moved methodically, orchestrating a slow, brutal campaign that would end the Creek Rebellion. Though he had a 3-to-1 advantage, he faced the most imposing Indian-built fortifications the American army would ever confront. When the army's 2 cannons struck the walls, 70 cannonballs failed to make a dent. Fortunately, the Cherokee cavalry took matters into their own hands. With the Red Sticks' attention fixed on the wall, women and children remained largely unprotected, save for the Tallapoosa River. 3 warriors swam across the 120-foot-wide river, stole 2 canoes, and returned. Soon, 200 Cherokee warriors had crossed, drawing Red Stick defenders from the front lines and allowing Jackson's infantry the chance to charge. The troops never breached the wall entirely, but the fighting inside of the fort carried the day. The aftermath was horrific. I had previously chastised the Red Sticks for atrocities like the Manly Raid, but the slaughter that followed was equally grotesque. Only 30 of more than 1,000 Red Sticks survived it. Letters from soldiers recount a child's skull crushed by the butt of a musket, and a 90-year-old man with dementia shot while pounding corn in a mortar, killed simply so a soldier could boast, "I had killed an Indian." That night, the Tallapoosa ran red with blood. The battle, known as Horseshoe Bend, marked the definitive end of Red Stick resistance. 1/6 of the Creek Nation perished. Jackson continued deeper into Creek territory, burning settlements in search of a fragile peace. For him, the victory was transformational. He finally commanded the unconditional support of his soldiers and emerged from the Tennessee frontier a national hero, celebrated as the man who decisively crushed a major native uprising during a faltering War of 1812. For the United States, Horseshoe Bend effectively ended the Creek War and opened over 20 million acres of tribal land in present-day Alabama and Georgia to white settlement. Even Creek allies were forced to cede land in the Treaty of Fort Jackson, a betrayal foreshadowing Jackson's future Indian policy. The battle cemented Jackson's military reputation, expanded U.S. territory, and signaled that violent removal rather than coexistence had become the new logic of American expansion. Andrew Jackson returned to Tennessee in the spring of 1814 as a conquering hero. His victory over the Red Stick Creeks had made him a household name across the American frontier, a symbol of relentless determination and unflinching will. In newspapers and taverns alike, stories of Old Hickory and his triumph at Horseshoe Bend spread like wildfire, sparking a rare wave of national pride during a war that had offered few reasons to celebrate. But Jackson's time at home would be brief. Even as he basked in his newfound fame, trouble was stirring to the south. The British, emboldened by victories in Europe, were turning their attention to the Gulf of Mexico. When they set their sights on New Orleans, it would once again be Andrew Jackson called to stand in their way. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.